I now give the call to the honourable member for Fadden.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's with some hesitation that I rise to lend some comment on the government's MRRT, especially to make the point categorically that I will not support it and will not vote for it. It is irresponsible, it is a simple grab for cash, and it's simply one more tax from this government. It's almost as if there wasn't a tax this government hasn't looked at attractively, almost as if there wasn't a profit this government didn't seek to tax. In coming to office 4 years ago, indeed 4 years ago this Thursday, there's now been 13 new or enhanced or emboldened taxes. Is it any wonder, of course, that they've asked Treasury within the Treasury documents to title taxes as savings? I'm not too sure how they reached that degree of hyperbole, but 13 new or enhanced or emboldened taxes. We've just passed the tax with respect to carbon, pollutant in the atmosphere. The fact that no other major advanced economy in the world has put in place an economy-wide tax, that the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada, respectively of South Korea and Japan, have all indicated they're going nowhere near an economy-wide tax. The price of a carbon credit in Europe is about $16 and falling. The Chicago carbon market, or the carbon exchange, before it collapsed, the price got down to a few cents. And I remember the government standing here under its original emissions trading scheme, lauding the Chicago exchange as an example of what should be done. I've heard nothing since it collapsed into such a huge hole. We know in Europe the carbon tax, of course, is 1/400th of the impost upon the Australian citizen, or on their citizens, as the Australian one is. On top of the carbon tax, in a great world of uncertainty with a 10-year bond rate for Greece is over 25%, of Italy and Spain is now over $6 or 6.5%, and of course the spread between French and German 10-year bonds has never been greater. At a time when commentators are speaking of a lost decade approaching us, where most commentators believe Italy cannot afford its repayments. Last week, when the ECB, the European Central Bank, revised growth from 1.8 to 0.5%, and we are facing the collapse of Italy, the 8th largest economy, amid its inability to pay its debts, and the financial contagion that may well eventuate, we have a government building on a carbon tax to make our industry more uncompetitive, and on top of that is now putting in a mining tax. It is beyond belief that a government facing such global uncertainties would consider putting greater imposts on our industry, but here it is. Can I just say the state of our federal government finances is parlous at best. The quality of the current government spending is less than parlous. Today in question time they lauded the great school hall program, $16 billion to build what are nice school halls, I'm sure. I've been in quite a number of them. But in terms of adding economic value to the economy, dubious at best. Every cent borrowed and interest being paid on school halls. The current budget is at the mercy of terms of trade which are at 140 years high, with record mineral export prices. A change in just 4% of these terms of trade will put the much-touted 12-13 budget surplus into the pipe dream status. We know that resource exports now stand at 57% of Australia's total exports, and increasing. Having increased from 41% in 2005, iron ore, of course, is the largest and coal the second largest export. This reflects, in most part, a sharp rise in global prices, which have increased at an average annual rate of 23% for iron ore and 8% for coal over the same period, measured in Australian dollars. We know that the Australian thermal coal price in October 2006 per Australian dollar per metric tonne was $62.62. It reached a height in July 2008 of $200 a metric tonne, and as of last month was $125 a metric tonne. You can see the wild price fluctuation. In between the $200 spike in July 2008 The price dropped below $90 in October 2009 and is up and down to $125 today. The government looks upon this as if they're walking into an Orthodox church and all they're seeing is the gold that glitters, as opposed to what the church stands for. In this case, they're looking at the graphs and saying, we could help our parlous state of finances by taxing this. The problem is that we have a structural deficit in our economy if mining resource prices come off, and that structural deficit will be exacerbated if the threat of European contagion from a default in Italy comes to mind, and economists are putting that as far more likely than not. We are a small open economy. We are incredibly vulnerable to export prices. Whilst the Italian default is likely, economists have also said it's too big to bail, $2.2 trillion worth of debt. The interest on that debt, rolling over $300 billion next year at 6.5%, the interest is 8% of GDP, $140 billion a year in interest. The Italian government under Berlusconi were saying, but our budget's in surplus, silently cough, cough, before interest payments. But they're at the point now where they can't afford the interest, let alone to keep their economy going. Economists are saying the best case now appears to be a recession in Europe, with the Chinese Vice Premier yesterday saying a global recession is likely. We pray this is not the case, and will certainly join the government in doing everything we can to ensure it's not the case, although for the most part, most of this is out of our hands. But public finances is about hoping for the best and planning for the worst. And in planning for the worst as the storm clouds gather is not about introducing new taxes. If Italy falls, if a degree of financial contagion moves, resource prices will come off. Will they collapse? No one knows. What if they halve? What if they halve back to October 2006 levels at $62? The structural deficit we have only gets worse. Andrew Robb, the member for Goldstein, made the point that despite the mining boom, we've had 3 record deficits, $50 billion and $22 billion thereabouts, leaving us a budget deficit, leaving us a net debt of something like $110 billion. Our current 10-year bond rate fluctuating around 4%. $4 billion a year in average terms upon that debt that we need to find, just in net terms, notwithstanding the fact that we actually have a gross borrowing approval limit in this House of up to $250 billion, and of course interest is paid on that gross level. But we have a structural deficit, the member for Goldstein makes the point, in this year's budget, which is twice Germany's structural deficit. An astonishing statement to make. He further goes on to say, on a per capita basis compared with Italy, one of the big economies in the world and one of the shakier ones, the point he makes, a structural deficit which is 30% greater. So on a per capita basis, he argues, we could be seen as twice as risky, twice as bad and twice as big as Germany, and compared to Italy, our structural deficit is 30% greater on a per capita basis. In anyone's language, this is a substantial vulnerability. Substantial. And faced with such a vulnerability, the question needs to be asked of a competent government, would you, facing such a vulnerability, impose an economy-wide carbon price that no other country in the world is doing, and a substantial hit in terms of a resource tax on our mineral wealth? Would you do it? And I think the answer, if you look at what parliaments across the world have unilaterally done, is a resounding no. Member for Goldstein continues that if there's a downturn in commodity prices, we may be facing a $50 to $70 billion deficits for years to come. Higher debt and all of the prosperity, all the blessings we've had from the mining boom may well be squandered. It's a sobering point the member for Goldstein makes. In terms of the government's attempts at taxation of our mineral resources, this is their second attempt. Their first attempt, of course, was literally to nationalise 40% of the resource sector. bring back views of Chifley in 47 trying to nationalise the banks, really, but I digress. Not only do they bungle their first proposal in terms of its design, 18 months later it is now being rushed through. The House will sit all night until this bill gets through. It's only Tuesday. There are a number of days left in Parliament in terms of debate and through it. It's almost as if this is a symbolic attempt at the PM trying to be seen to be achieving something. And if you look at what the miners will pay, it's instructive. The budget estimates, of course, have numbers in the multiples of billions of dollars, original estimates up towards $8 billion. Yet BDO research said the mining tax liability on Rio Tinto for the first 5 years would be zero. They calculated the mining tax liability on BHP, and the numbers is zero again. They've taken the real-life numbers of a small emerging miner, revenues up to $700 million, and looked at its mining tax revenue. First year, next year, zero. Second, 49 million. Third, 107. Fourth, 96. Fifth, 68. The following year, 63 million, which results in an effective total tax rate of 40.18% in the first year, 45.68% in the second, 45.76% in the third, 46.12% in the fourth, and 46.2% in the fifth year. It's been described that this tax is attacking the goose laid the golden egg. We're looking at a taxation rate that will go upwards of 45% upon these miners, and up to a $700 million mining company. That is not a large cap mining house. Companies will need to find those resources to pay it. Yet Rio and BHP, who can amortise enormous losses, won't be paying anything at all in the first years. It reeks, it absolutely reeks of Mark Latham's 2004 hit list, but this time the hit list is on companies who are apparently far too wealthy. Labor members in this House, I've listened to their speeches, and all they've done is attack the wealth of the likes of Gina Rinehart, Clive Palmer and others, as if to say, well, you're wealthy, we're going to take it from you and redistribute it because we as the government know best. Even the Howard government, which never professed to know best. And whilst this government has tried to denigrate what the Howard government did, let me tell you what they did with the first mining boom. $106 billion in net debt was what Prime Minister Keating left in 1996. And by the time that was paid off, that $106 billion in net debt, a further $57 billion was paid off in interest. Over $160 billion was paid off because of Labor's last debt. A couple of years of sunshine, $60 billion was put away in the bank in terms of the future fund to offset future liabilities in superannuation for public servants and the military and to deal with an ageing population post-2020. $20 billion in the bank from the 06-07 surplus, and the 07-08 surplus was a further $20 billion. $160 billion thereabout paid off in Labor's debt, including interest. $100 billion in cash put aside or in surplus from the 07-08 budget. It was the world's 10th largest sovereign fund at the time. That was $260 billion that the government put aside from the first mining boom. $250 billion was put aside. That's what a responsible government does in a mining boom. It lives within its means. It saves and is frugal. It does its best to share the wealth of that around, whilst also meeting its responsibilities, and be under no doubt the reason why we as a country were able to manage many of the ravages of the GFC was China was, of course, buying our minerals. We had no debt thanks to the Howard years. We had at least $40 billion in spare cash putting aside the future fund, and our interest rates were comparatively high, so monetary policy could be eased. If writing cheques would see us through the GFC, why did no other country in the world fare so well and they wrote bigger cheques than us? Because it had nothing to do with cheque writing and everything to do with prudent fiscal policy. What we see here is a tax on mining that is poorly constructed, that is poorly thought through, that is being implemented at the worst possible time when the world is facing some significant ravages out of Italy. It is hallmark and symptomatic of a government that continues to lose its way.
Order.